Hello, and welcome to Building SaaS with Python and Django. I'm your streamer. I'm Matt Lehman. I'm a software engineer. I've been doing Python for a long time, probably about 10 years. And I do web development for my day job. And so I work on a project here in the stream to try and teach people about how to make web applications that are more involved in the kind of tutorials that you'll find online. We focus on Python and the Django web framework, and Django is the most popular, I think it's the most popular web framework in the Python world, the Python ecosystem. Specifically, we look at a tool that I run called College Conductor. College Conductor is a software as a service, which just means it's essentially an online business, and it serves people. It's a membership kind of site, and it serves college admissions counselors. The details of how College Conductor works, or the domain, I should say, is not super important to understanding a lot out of this stream. I explain the code at a totally different level, and anytime you need to know something specific to colleges, I take the time to explain that. So I don't expect you to be a proficient college admissions person to understand what's going on. We spend most of our time looking at code and talking code concepts and talking web frameworks and all that stuff. This just happens to be the subject of this SaaS. I do encourage people to chat. The purpose of this stream is to teach primarily. So I love questions, and I take the time to answer them, whether I know the answer or not. We can at least have some chat about them. I do ask that if you do have a question, please try and keep it scoped to at least Python, and preferably web applications. I've gotten some kind of left field questions in the past, which I can try and attempt to tackle, but I can't promise too much. You can find me on social media if you want to connect in other avenues. I am MB Lehman on Twitter. I have a channel on YouTube where I put recordings from these streams, which might be where you're watching this from today. And I am totally available to chat, discuss, ask questions, give you my thoughts on web development. I run a website which is up in the corner of my display. It's mattlehman.com, where I blog about these topics as well. So if you want to join me there, join the mailing list. There's all sorts of ways that you can connect with me and get some information about what I'm trying to share. Okay, so, and then finally, I guess if you're actually watching the stream live, please do follow, subscribe, so that in future streams you'll know when I'm starting to stream and can join in and get in on the ground floor. Today is going to be a little bit more freeform than some of the past streams. I do have a particular thing I want to accomplish in mind, but I don't have super direct thoughts on how to get there. So what we're going to cover is deployment. If you've been joining me the last few streams, you've watched me build out an admin dashboard to house tools for me to use as the background administrator to make the College Conductor service have more data and or richer, more connected data that adds value to the service. But we, at the end of each stream, have just sort of stopped it as, here's the feature, and here are the tests. It seems like it's working. We've got it working locally, but it leaves the question of, what is the next step? Where after I stop the stream, where do I normally go? What am I normally doing? And I didn't want that to be a mystery, and it's not a mystery. So I wanted to take some time in this stream to walk through the actual deployment process of, what do I do with my fairly small website, how do I actually get it to the production system, which is a DigitalOcean droplet, which is a virtual machine that's hosted on DigitalOcean's infrastructure. And so we're going to talk through that. I've kind of outlined the steps that I want to go through, and we'll poke at some stuff. We'll give some context for what we're trying to do and the actual feature that's going out, and we'll just walk it through each point along the way, and we'll talk about some deployment thinking and design of, if you were to work at a company, what might people be doing at that company to actually have some sort of stability in their system, so that the stuff that is fresh features out of the gate versus what users are seeing, how do we make sure that that stuff has had time to stabilize and mature so that we're not breaking things for our users on the other side? That's kind of the goal of this. So we're going to start, I guess I'll recap a little bit, just 30 seconds of the developer viewpoint of the thing that we worked on, so that you can know what it is we're actually trying to get out to the production site. So I started this by starting up a tool called Ancho, which I've discussed in previous streams. Ancho is a tool for managing multiple processes. And for my development server, that's very convenient because it gives me one viewport that I can look at what's going on with my web server, what's going on with my background worker, what's going on with my front-end tooling, and it's all filtered into one place. And you can see over the side here, the output is prefixed along the way so that we know what I'm doing. But that's not going to be the environment that we ultimately end up at. So let's jump over to the code, or jump over to the web, I should say, and let's look at the site. Just quickly see what it is I've built. So right out of the gate, you can see I have the Django debug toolbar. That's what this thing is over on the side. This does not show up on the real site. This is a tool that I can use as a developer. So there's one element right off the bat that shows that this is not going to be what shows up in front of the users. So I'm going to start by logging in with my, this is all local data, so I don't actually have 8-character passwords and use my name as my login here. So it's just a way to get me something that I can play with. But what we worked on the last couple of weeks was two things. One was this page right here, which was a basic admin dashboard, which is a place that I could hook in new tools. And the thing we finished last week was this automated tool of how do we go through and connect schools that we care about. So that is what I want to see on the site. If we go over to the live site today and I log in and use my much longer password to log into my production data, I'm a super user on this site. So I have views that people don't see. Like if you are a regular user, you won't see an admin. This was a convenient shortcut that I added so that as the user, I could jump in and dig at the data that's here on my site. But you can notice between what's on the development server and what's on the production server is this missing that tools link. That is another thing that will be added once we go to production. So it's time to actually start moving in that direction. This is the feature. If you want to learn more about what this feature does, we might get to that later in the stream where I poke at the actual production data. But if you want to learn the guts of how this was implemented, go check out other recordings that are on YouTube, episodes 10 and 11 on my channel, on the Building SaaS channel playlist. But let's start with what we want to do today. So, and before I get into like running commands, let's take a moment to pause and talk about the pieces that I have in place. So you just saw the development server. It is very much tailored to my local machine. It is not the environment that I'm running. It's not even the same operating system. I'm running on Mac OS here, and DigitalOcean. I'm not running Mac OS on DigitalOcean. I'm running Linux. So we have to kind of ratchet up things to be closer to what production is running. And there are probably a spectrum of different sites you can have, but the simplest kind of structure that gives you something more than going from dev to production is to have an intermediate. And the intermediate name is often called staging. A staging server tries to be close to your production server. I've seen it implemented in a number of ways where some staging servers might actually be connected to the production database. I've seen that. I've seen staging servers that have full replications of the production data, so that they have realistic data, but they aren't really the real data. Just sort of a copy of the data that gets kind of replicated each night or something to that effect. And the version of staging that I'm going to show today is something that gets closer to the operating system and the deployment environment, but doesn't have a lot of the actual data similarity that's on production. So it's not like I'm copying anything over. And the reason I'm doing that is because this is a very small effort, and I'm trying to keep cost way down. So I have a small droplet on DigitalOcean for the production stuff, but for what I'm doing for my staging, I'm actually running it through a tool called Vagrant. And Vagrant is a fantastic development tool, but it also can be used in this context as a way to, in a sense, replicate the virtual machine in production. So Vagrant is a virtualization tool, and the way you use Vagrant is to create a Vagrant file. And why don't we let's take a look at it while we're chatting about it. It's a configuration file that specifies what operating system do you want to use, what virtualization technology do you want to use. In this case, I'm using VirtualBox, and then some configuration of how do you want to start your environment. So I'm going to get into more of these bits down here in a moment, but that's just the general concept of you use this tool, you start a virtual machine, and you can put whatever you want on it using various techniques. You can either copy it there yourself using kind of SSH or SCP commands, or you can use provisioning, which is what I'm going to cover in a second. So we start by running a command called vagrant up. Vagrant up is to bring the server up, to start it, boot it, set everything, and we're gonna have some fun here today, it seems. All right, we got some work to do. So what should have happened, had we not had some failure, was it would start the virtual machine and do and make the necessary connections so that the virtual machine is connected into your host network, and in my case, the Mac OS, and it would allow us to then interface with that machine using Secure Shell, SSH. I think what happened that we have to solve is I upgraded my Mac OS environment from Sierra to High Sierra to Mojave, whatever the right names are. And what I didn't do along the way is upgrade VirtualBox. So I suspect that the VirtualBox that I have installed is not compatible with my operating system. Okay, well, here's the life of a developer. Sometimes you have to go upgrade stuff. So I'm going to go to VirtualBox. We're going to download it and install it and go through this process and see if we can debug this now. So we are on, I mean, they're still calling it OS X, but that's okay. So let's try and save it. And we're going to wait a minute because it's not a tiny download. Thankfully, my internet's not too slow. Hopefully we get this working. Otherwise, we're going to have a very sort of boring stream tonight, or we're going to have to switch subjects because I won't be able to show you deployment stuff, which is sort of the purpose of the stream. So VirtualBox, I guess, if I can explain what that is for a second, is the actual virtualization technology. And virtualization, if you're not familiar with that even, is a way to pretend to be hardware. So double click on this. It says, there we go. So virtualization is a piece of software that runs on your host operating system and can pretend to be hardware to something else. So that was sort of vague, but let's think back to my Vagrant Box thing that I was showing you just a second ago. So I said that I deploy this to Linux, and specifically I use Ubuntu Linux, and I run Ubuntu 18.04, that's the version. So when I'm running Vagrant, I want to run everything in Linux. So I need to let my Mac OS pretend to be a different computer so that Ubuntu will install on top of that nice and solidly, and think that it's running on a piece of hardware. So once this is all wrapped up, that is a horrible, okay, how can I clarify that for you, VicJ? What is a horrible explanation about virtualization? You know what it is. Okay. Can you enlighten the rest of us on what you think I'm missing? Because if I'm explaining it poorly, I don't want to lead people astray. I mean, I can go into a lot more depth. Yeah, that's true. It's a close thing to hardware emulation. Yeah, that's a great point. So it does kind of mirror the system calls and all sorts of stuff. It's making a place. It's making a place for an operating system to live on top of. It's my definition was not great. Thank you for the clarification or the explanation. We all think differently, right? So worked for me in my head, but I can understand that that my definition doesn't work for everybody. So let's see. We've got let's try Vagrant up again, and I'll be happy to take a look. How do you set up a network within a network with Vagrant? So Vagrant has some questions, some configuration, and I honestly don't know all of the details, gotta be honest. But if you see this setting here, you can go to the Vagrant docs and you can find network, and there is a few different varieties. I'm using the private network option, which means it kind of like maps into my host network. But there's like a bridging mode, if I recall correctly. There's a couple of others that run in different ways, and I use this one and it works for me, so I kind of eject the other modes from my head. But it is yes, it is all based on the host. Again, I don't know if there are other network modes that aren't based on the host. I don't know what they are because I don't need to use them. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. So this works for me, and it is a mode that can work for others. And if you have different networking needs, like you have a more complex network, I guess I would have to defer to what the thing says. Sure thing. Yeah, no problem. Happy to respond. All right, so it looks like we also have, it still failed. So why did it fail? It could be that my box is now old, and is installed, blah, blah, blah. It's hard to like read specific error messages and talk out loud at the same time. So let's try this. We're just gonna blow it all away and see how it goes. So what might be happening right now is that, open my Vagrant file. What is it you'd like to see? What might be happening is that when I created this particular image, it was designed for this previous version of VirtualBox, which was designed for the previous version of macOS, and now it's just not playing nicely, and we'd have to upgrade it. One of the nice parts about Vagrant, though, is that these virtual machines are meant to be very disposable. Like if you do this right and set up your provisioning scripts right, and that's going to be the true test to see if I actually did this correctly, I should be able to basically throw this all away, start it back up again, and start fresh. Should discuss how to do a CI server. Okay, yep, I have CI, I run Circle CI, so we can talk about that too. More interesting to you, I'll say. That's the nice caveat. So VirtualBox, as requested, that, yeah, I told you to destroy. That's a good point. You are the only viewer here at the moment. I do record this on YouTube though as well, so yeah, thank you. I was about to do force as well. Well, man, it is just not playing nicely. So we might have to fall back to other stuff as a topic. And I will have to probably play with this offline. My thing, yeah, it is pretty messed up at the moment. Okay, so let's do CI. Why not? So I guess before I even get to the CI stuff then, let me back up and explain what that is for people that might not know. When I finish a feature today, I currently commit my work to GitHub and I push it back up to the GitHub origin repository. And my GitHub repository is hooked into another service. I happen to use a service called Circle CI, which CI, as Vic J pointed out, is continuous integration. And the job of continuous integration is to essentially watch for changes and then run whatever you tell it to run. So for me, Circle CI is running through a gauntlet of checks to check on the quality of my work. And I already have committed and pushed, so there's nothing to view per se, but we can get into Circle CI and look at some stuff and check it out. So Circle CI takes a configuration file, and what I'm describing here is one particular CI system, but there are others. Popular in the open source space is Travis CI, which I use on some of my open source projects that I maintain. If you do more of like .NET work, there's stuff like AppVer. I believe Microsoft now has offerings that they do. So it's a robust ecosystem of competition, and that's all good for capitalists out there, I suppose. But Circle CI is just the tool that I picked because I had some experience with it. And let's check it out. So each time I do a push to CI, GitHub fires a webhook that Circle CI is kind of listening for, which queues the work and goes through my configuration file and runs a set of steps along the way. So you can see this is the thing that we did at the last stream. After the stream was over, I committed that stuff and I pushed it up and I had a successful build. So we can take a look specifically at what one of these things look like. Yeah, I'm not going to go through the whole sample project. I don't really, that's not really the scope of what I'm trying to do today. I can describe it in the context of this, because the goal of this stream is to focus on an applet is established and has stuff going with it. And I can get a toy demo app going, but I think the Circle CI documentation is pretty good. So if you need to get something started from scratch, that's a good way to go. But I can at least explain what Circle CI is and how it works to give you an idea of what your configuration might look like. So when I run CI, let's kind of jump back over here. There is a few stages, and it breaks it down by I haven't been on here in a while, so it seems like, what are you doing over here? Sorry. It's going nuts over here. Get it together, circle. Well, where did my stuff go? UI might be not working in our favor tonight. Because I should see either my jobs, like this is stuff that I've done for a different group. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in my GitHub. You know, like you guys don't need to see my contracting work. That's silly. And we're interested in Conductor, not my previous job. Okay, here it is. Finally getting there. Sorry about that. So I have a pretty simple pipeline, and Conductor, CircleCI works by doing things in build jobs, and it kind of breaks them in, and you can make your jobs fan out to more than one job. You can kind of make you essentially make a dependency graph of the things you care about. For me, with my needs today, I don't have a ton that I need to do in here. I really am building installing some Python dependencies, running some lint checking, which is like static analysis, and then running my test suite. And so probably about a year, maybe a year or maybe 2 years at this point, Circle switched their configuration to move in a much more container-centric model for doing things. So in each of your jobs, you start with a container, a Docker container, and use that as the basis for what you're going to build. And then you use a set of steps, and some of them are built in, like checkout. That's a step that, like its name implies, checks out your repository. And then you decide the commands that you want to run to make that step do something meaningful. And then you can pass that information along, or you can do other things. So let's take it bit by bit to see what's going on here. I have 3 jobs in this thing, and my first job is to build the Python dependencies and cache them. So I don't want each of my Python-based jobs to have to install all of my dependencies each time, because that's time consuming. So what this job does is it just goes through and pulls out a cache, and that cache is keyed by what I'm doing here. So it's taking, I have 2 files in my repository. One is called requirements, and one is called requirements dev. And these 2 pieces together determine the set of Python packages that I have that I go through pip install using pip install-r requirements.txt and pip install-r requirements dev. Actually, these 2 lines right here. So those kind of describe a manifest of the things that I need to install every time that I run through CI. So the first attempt that happens is it's trying to restore from a cache, and it does a checksum on these 2 files. And a checksum is a fancy way of saying, give me a unique number based on the contents of these files. I'm not going to go into what checksums really are at the computer science level. Go read about checksums if you're interested. But essentially, what comes out of this is something that is a unique key name. So it'll be pycache some number dash some number. And if CircleCI can look into my account and find a cache that matches that label, it will bring that into the image and put that into the file system at the places that it goes, so there's less work to do. So it tries to, step 1 is to restore the cache. If it's if my requirements or my requirements dev changed and that thing is not in the cache, it will be a cache miss, and this step will basically be do nothing, which is okay because the next thing that we do is actually run through and install dependencies. Okay, so I construct a virtual environment. There might be other ways to do this now, but this is the way that I did it at the time. And then I run the pip command to actually do my installation of packages. The final step of my build job is to then take this using the same key as I had before. That's the important part. And take these paths of what was stored in this virtual environment and what was stored in my pip cache. And CircleCI will then take those directories, zip them up into an archive, and put it at this cache key for later usage. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. So the next step gets into like the actual usage of those installed packages. So you can go through the flow. Lint is the name that gets used for any sort of analysis you want to run on code that is tooling that checks for code quality, checks for things like styling and formatting, and things that you can see below. So my lint job does a checkout of the code. It tries to restore from that cache that was just saved previously up here in the build py step of the pipeline. And then now that all of those things are installed, I actually run my different commands that I have here. And these things, if any of them fail along the way, will actually fail that job and fail the step, and I will get alerted. I use Slack for monitoring this project. So I have CircleCI connected into Slack, and give me just a moment here. We'll get it started. This is just like my hub of information that I care about. And every time I push, you can see I get messages, and occasionally like I mess stuff up. Like, here it's telling me, oops, I didn't do some linting in advance, so this thing failed. So what failed was I was missing a type check. I went back in and added that. So that's how I get status out of this, the end of this at the end, after everything is all done. Finally, we get so we're going through each phase, each job in the pipeline, and it's got to, all three of them need to succeed in order for the test to be considered as a success. And so the final thing is to again pull from Python, do a checkout of the code, restore the cache, and this time we're running the test suite. And so that's commonly what continuous integration systems get used for, is to run a test suite to make sure that your code is actually running correctly. But you can use continuous integration to do a whole host of things. You can have more complicated setups where you are building packages or artifacts or whatever you want to call them, things that you will actually then take and use for your deployment. So let's say that you're actually deploying to a Kubernetes environment, or oh man, I'm totally blanking out. Amazon has a managed version of container stuff. Doesn't matter. There's a lot of ways that Docker images can be deployed. So maybe what your CI system is doing is building a Docker image that is intended to be plopped right into your infrastructure. And so you build the image and push to your container registry, where then your infrastructure can pull from that easily. That is another thing that is commonly done. So the final bit of the CircleCI configuration is to define the whole workflow. It defines the jobs that are part of it and sets the what is the sequence that I have. And so that syntax is not too fiddly, but you can see, like, if you had, let's say I had 4 jobs, and this lint job actually depended on 2 things. So you'd use requires, have a list of what are the things that the other things that would start or be required to finish before the lint job even started. So that's CI in a nutshell. Vicjay, do you have any questions about that you want me to pause and answer? Well, if I see them in a second, I'll stop for sure. Okay, cool. I'm bothered by this enough. Like, I'm gonna have to solve this at some point. So why not try and solve it now? This and Docker. Yeah, Docker's pretty powerful, and it can make your life. If you can make a good Docker image that drops into some of these things, you can really have an easy deployment setup. And so what I was going to walk through tonight is using Ansible. And Ansible is like, it's very much configure it all yourself, start up your own virtual machines, set all of the things. Like, it's a pretty intensive approach to building things. And honestly, like, if I was to recommend a deployment strategy for people getting into web applications today, I'd probably say don't use Ansible. Eventually, it's a very cool, powerful tool if you want to get that involved. But if you're trying to just get a business off the ground, you're probably going to be best served by something like a platform as a service, like Heroku, where a lot of this stuff even doesn't matter. Like, you wouldn't even need to build an image. Like, a Heroku does a lot of the packaging for you and plugs your application, your web application, right into their infrastructure, and really makes it a no-brainer. It's a little bit more expensive, but if time is the factor that is most important to you, then yeah, that's totally a way to go. So let's think about what else might be happening. Vagrant well, I'm going to pause a second and like really read this message and maybe get it into my head, because I think I've been reading it and skimming over it and it's not been sinking in. So sorry for the awkward silence, but there's going to be awkward silence. Okay, so what version of VirtualBox did I just install? Was it 6? Maybe that's why. Come on, guys. There it is. 6. Okay, so here's the problem. And Vagrant is screaming at us right in the face, telling us what the problem is. And sometimes, you just need a second to like parse in your head what this is. So I just installed VirtualBox 6, and it is very clearly saying here that Vagrant, this version of Vagrant anyway, supports only up to 5.2. Okay, so we can try and solve this one of two ways. I'd rather upgrade everything, if that makes sense. So we're going to go to Vagrant and see if their latest version supports VirtualBox. Sorry, that doesn't say that. I'll download that in a minute if we can get that. I want confirmation and documentation of what it supports. Oh my word, and I'm not going to read a changelog to go through this. There it is. Ah, cool. Add support VirtualBox 6. So I'm going to make the claim that if we get this version of Vagrant, we can get back in business. I'll probably still have to do a Vagrant destroy, but that's okay. Because I really want to be able to do this. I think this is, what I was telling people I could do, and wish we could do it. Okay. Oh my word, come on. So let's try again, and I might need a new shell. The degree in the back is actually my wife's degree, but yes, we went to the same school. Both went to the University of Virginia. I got my undergraduate, I'm actually wearing a UVA engineering shirt today. So I got my degree in computer engineering, and then no, computer engineering, so that's the mix of like electrical engineering and comp sci, which was really fun. I was actually way better at the electrical engineering, and then got a lot more into programming much later in life. But I do have a master's in computer science from Johns Hopkins as well, so for what that's worth. Okay, we want to make sure we're working in the virtual environment. And now let's see if we can salvage the virtual machine that's there. It might still be busted because it might want to work with older versions of that. But we can cross our fingers to see if it will boot up. This is promising. This is looking like a normal startup sequence for Vagrant. So you can see here that it's doing some network configuration. Terminal would like, no thanks. Terminal does not need to access my microphone. Johns Hopkins APL. No, I didn't go to the applied physics lab. I did. Johns Hopkins has a master's program for people who are working. I used to work for Lockheed Martin and got my degree while I was a full-time employee. I'm blanking out on the name of that program off the top of my head, but that's where I did it through. So there's some cool stuff going on. I actually have a plugin for Vagrant that does automatic installation of guest additions. So that's a little confusing. What is that? When you are, oh, very cool. Anything you're allowed to talk about, or is it all hush hush? I got a bit of both of those in my career. So no worries. Yeah, it's the funny part is like some of that stuff that's supposed to be secret is rather dull. I'm in Frederick, Maryland. So we're installing guest additions here. And guest additions are, cool. Hello, fellow Marylander. Guest additions are things that get installed into a virtual machine to let the virtual machine play nicer with the host operating system. By default, the host operating system and the virtual machine operating system, they don't really know anything about each other, and that's by design. Because if the virtual machine knew that it was not in hardware, it just, how is it supposed to react to that? I don't really have an answer, but it's not the way that virtualization is designed to work. But VirtualBox, in order to do better like mapping of directories to from the host operating system to the virtual machine, is something that is a useful feature. Like Vagrant uses this actually pretty regularly, so it does a mount into the virtual machine and gives you access to like the code that's at your host OS and kind of makes it transparent, which is really cool. But the guest additions help make that possible. Without these like modules being added into the virtual machine, it might work, but it's not guaranteed to. So anyway, the plugin that I have goes and checks, does my operating system that I'm using as my virtual machine have the guest additions in it? And if it doesn't, it fixes all that up automatically. There are ways to do it manually, but this is a really cool tool. And I don't remember, let me see, Vagrant plugins? Ooh. I think there's a way to list them. Well, that's too much of a rabbit hole. But if you are using Vagrant, there are some useful plugins out there that you should check out. So we have started the virtual machine. That's what Vagrant Up did. And it did a bunch of stuff and connected some ports so that this is now accessible, or should be accessible, on my operating system. And I have something in my etc host file to, if you'll remember looking back at that Vagrant file, I had mapped it to a specific IP address to 10.123, and for the purposes of doing development, I named that IP address to this. So if you want to learn a tiny bit about networking, you have a file on your system called etc hosts. It's where a bunch of networking stuff is defined, and you can add in things that when your host normally does IP and domain name resolution and all that kind of stuff, it goes and does a lot of stuff. It's a very big subject, but part of the process along the way is if you want to define other names or custom names that only apply to your machine, you can modify this etc host file yourself to make in direct mappings. So you can see I did that here. I took that IP address number that I assigned to my private network. The 10.1 space is like it's a reserved network space that you're not going to find on the public internet. So it's kind of like just for your machine, whatever you want to do. And so I used part of that networking space and said that this name, when I type it into my browser, will resolve to this IP address. And since Vagrant is looking at that IP address on that port, on port 443, I can type in Conductor test, and I'm actually getting, I'm not hitting the internet, I'm hitting my Vagrant box, which just happens to look like it's something on the internet. So this is what I use as my staging environment. And I do it because it's cheaper than spinning up a second droplet on DigitalOcean. And maybe that's really cheap of me considering the amount of work it took and the cost of DigitalOcean. But I was just super cost conscious when I started this project, and it was a fun challenge. But this is essentially a web server that's running in Ubuntu 18.04 that my Mac is running that operating system. So it's kind of, you can see there's lots of layers involved here. But I use this to test out my provisioning scripts, and that's where Ansible comes into play. So the way that when I started this stream, I started up Ancho, and you saw that start my web server and my background worker and some front-end work, and it did all of that there, but that was all those pieces just running like in process. This setup right here is meant to run like using operating system services or process management tools, I should say, that reflect how I run things in production. And so when I am using Vagrant, I use the same set of tools to put the code out to this site. And that tool is Ansible. Ansible, let me bring up we can look at the docs for a minute. So Ansible falls into the category of configuration management tools. You might have heard of other tools in this arena like Chef or Puppet. There are older ones like CF Engine. There are probably newer ones that I'm not aware of, but Ansible is a pretty big one, and it's written in Python, which is a win in my column, obviously, since I'm doing a stream all about Python stuff, and I'm a big Python advocate. So I use Ansible to put all my stuff together. The way Ansible does that is with, what do they call things, roles and playbooks. And so the terminology in Ansible is a little funny. It's sort of sports centric, and tasks, yeah. Ansible is a deep topic that we're not going to be able to explore to its full depths, but the biggest term that they use is something called playbooks. And playbooks are sets of stuff that run to put your site together. And the playbooks are different kinds of tasks that have different purposes and roles. Yeah, I'm going to get to roles in just a second. And roles, these playbooks can be grouped in different ways. The common unit for that grouping is what Victor just pointed out of roles. And so it's a way to carve up what your environment is supposed to look like, or how you want it to look like, and group things in a logical way. You can see here that some of these are external roles that I brought in from outside sources. Like I use Datadog, and they have an Ansible integration. I have to do Node.js for doing my front-end deployment stuff, so I brought in that external thing. But this DB and load balancer and messaging and web and worker, those are all roles that I have defined to put my service together. Let's look a little bit at web, just because we're talking about a web application. This might be the most relatable to the people. So there is a structure that is proposed by the Ansible documentations of ways to group your tasks and group your roles and the things that you execute. And so I'm following those guidelines. So this directory structure is laid out according to those. So within a role, you have a tasks directory, and that has a main file. And I'll actually, while we're here, notice that these are YAML files. That's why YML is the yet another markup language, is what that represents. And so each task is a list. Ansible Galaxy. Yeah. I use Ansible Galaxy. We can look at that in a second. So each task along the way is things that you can tell your target to do. My target, well, I have two targets. I have one that's my virtual machine, which does the installation. I also have my production website. It's running the same set of tasks side by side, and that's what gives you the confidence that if I can get through my staging setup, which is running basically all the same tasks, and it succeeds, that gives me a fairly high degree of confidence that my production is going to do anything. I can't run Yum because I'm running Ubuntu, but yes, if I was running, there are other ways you could do this, for sure. So, this web tasks is running and doing a bunch of installation of necessary packages. I'm turning on different firewall ports, or opening different ports to my firewall to make sure that I can permit different kinds of traffic for different reasons. I have fail to ban turned on so that it helps mitigate some of the SSH script kiddies that are out there. All sorts of stuff ends up going into building out. Yum shouldn't work on Ubuntu because Yum is the Red Hat and the Fedora package manager route. So the equivalent on Ubuntu is apt, apt. If Yum works on Ubuntu, that is news to me. Yeah, let's try it. So this is the way you get into the virtual machine. You interact with it just like a SSH, like you remote into other places. And Yum, what are you? Okay, apt search Yum. Let's see if it's something installable in repositories. This is curious. Well, would you look at that? I have no idea why RPMs, or how in the world would RPMs work. So RPM, that is super weird. What does that do? Okay, fun little side project, I guess, for another day of finding out what in the world is this for in the Debian landscape. I don't know. That's kind of cool. Okay, so you can install stuff, and my web thing is installing all the packages I have. It's installing Python stuff and virtual environments. It's installing NPM stuff. It is running my process manager, I could spend probably like 3-4 streams like detailing task by task, what is this doing and why, and why did I do it. I don't think we really have time for all of that, but the point of all of this is say that Ansible helps to make your deployment one big automated thing. Like when I deploy, there is zero, I mean, aside from me typing one command to start, well, thank you. There's one command for me to start with this stuff, and that's it. I'm hands off after that. And that's the way that most deployments ideally should be. Like, you should have, if you can, fully automated deployments, because it's going to make your life better for managing a site like this, especially if you're a one-man operation or one-person operation like I am. Okay, so how do we actually do this for Vagrant? Vagrant, come back to the Vagrant file, and you can configure provisioners. Vagrant works with a number of provisioners. Ansible is one of them, and so I had to do some finagling to make this work correctly, because Vagrant didn't want to play properly with my private key in a bunch of ways. So this took a little bit of fiddling with in order to get right. So good time to note, if you are interested in checking out any of this code, this is a public repository. So let me drop a link, and you're certainly welcome to check out anything yourself. I'm working from, I used the GitHub issue system to kind of specify what I'm going to be doing, and it also helps to steer the discussion. So we're going through some of this stuff tonight, and we've not even checked off item number 1 because we detoured to CI and Vagrant was busted. So we're getting there. I don't think we're going to get to some of the later points, but that's totally okay. So Ansible is doing the whole deployment, right? And we configured Vagrant to do Ansible. So these are the basic settings that were required in order to get this done. And so I had to tell Ansible what my servers were, and that was enough to get it going. Because that's still super vague, so let me show you part of where is it? Here it is. Part of the way Ansible works is you have to, like, one half of it is defining the tasks that you have to run and all of the roles that have to run, all the pieces that are involved in doing your deployment. The other part is specifying who is what role. And for Vagrant, everything is named the name for all of my parts is this web01 label. And so I have to tell Ansible that when you're doing your provisioning and you're going through this manifest of what are the different roles and what are the different things, we have to connect it. That's kind of it's a little vague, but it's sort of how it's, and I'm drawing a blank on the term. Is it just the host file? I don't know. Somebody can correct me if I'm getting my Ansible naming convention wrong. But this was also a necessary bit that you can see here. Like, I have development children of anytime I run development, all of these things have to run, and we'll see as we run Ansible in a moment that each of these categories runs, and these are connected to different roles. So I think I'm missing one more piece. That's probably why this is so confusing. And I apologize. It's been a long while since I looked at this stuff. So this Playbooks development file, which is, here it is. It's the inventory. That's the name I was looking for. Is the inventory. And the inventory is what I described. It's the mapping of the named hosts with what role they are supposed to represent. And so you can see over here in my inventory that my Web01 Vagrant machine is going to represent my DB servers. And my Web01 is also going to represent my load balancer. And it's going to do everything because I have it all shoved into one box. And when the provisioner runs, it's starting from this file, this site YAML. And the site YAML says, go through each of these other YAML files. And let's look at one of them. And this should hopefully connect all the dots together in the end. So if we look at the DB servers YAML file, it will say, target the DB servers hosts and run the DB role. And so now you can finally trace everything together, that the DB servers is Web01, which is pointed to this DB servers file, which says to run this DB role. That's a lot. So let's just maybe watch Vagrant do the actual provisioning, and maybe that'll make more sense. But the summation is all of the roles are all pointing at Web01, so it's going to run all of the roles. That's the TLDR. So if I run Vagrant provision, it should get started, and we're going to start seeing Ansible output. I have not run this in a while, so there's a good chance that this will break, which is why I'm running this on staging first, and rather than production. The area it's most likely to break is every once in a while I have to bump the version of Node, because JavaScript people, I love you, but you're kind of crazy at the same time because you upgrade stuff so freaking fast. So we'll see if Node.js requires an update. But this is standard Ansible output. It's taking through, and we can pause at one of them. So it's going right down the list of what was in the site YAML file. And the first thing was that DB servers file. And so it's saying the DB servers file said run the DB role. And so if we went into the DB role and went into the tasks that were for that role, you'd find all of these things that I've listed here. I'm installing Postgres, setting up things over and over, setting various configuration. And then it moves on to the next file and the next role. But all of these, again, are pointing at Web01. So everything along here, there's only one host that's going to be modifying along the way, and that's going to be Web01. Oh, look at that. It made it through Node. That's so exciting, which means we're likely to finish all the way. So now we just have to be patient for a moment and see it all complete. And this is all happening on my local machine. So Ansible is doing SSH connections, but they're being very short. It's the shortest trip you can ever expect, because you can't get any faster than running that kind of stuff on your local connection. So when we do this in production, it won't go quite this fast, but that's okay. So we got through everything, and let's look at this guy in particular for a moment. You can do anything you want in Ansible, essentially. It's pretty freeform, and there are ways to run arbitrary commands on it too. So like literally anything you can do on a computer, you should theoretically be able to do in Ansible. Part of what I have configured is rollbar. Rollbar is an error tracking service. So if I have errors that happen in production or errors that happen in staging, I can view them. And I brought up rollbar here, and you can see it's already got a connection to my repository, so it knows the pieces that I haven't even deployed yet. If I refresh this page now, it should say, oh, I'm filtered on production, so let's go to development. And turn off production for a minute, actually. Okay, so development is I named this kind of poorly. Like I think this a more accurate name for this would have been staging, but you know, when I put this together, I thought I might have had another step. It didn't end up happening. So it says development. It really means staging. Please just humbly accept my apologies to that I named poorly. But you can see here we've got our deployment, and the last time I deployed was actually quite a while ago. So I've been doing a bunch of stuff on the stream, and I haven't actually been pushing it out to the site, which is probably not a best practice for me. I should be more in a habit of pushing, and maybe every once in a while we go through this kind of process of talking about deploys and checking things out and make sure that the stuff that we're actually feature developing on the stream works in reality. So here's the deploy. It's got a bunch of stuff. This is not an advertisement for Rollbar. I think they're a cool service, but you know, it's something you can use as part of your system if you are doing you know, apps online. And I strongly encourage you to have some kind of error tracking service, because they're very useful. And there's a bunch of them. There's like Sentry and Rollbar, and oh, of course I blank out on like the other three that were on the tip of my tongue, but Rollbar's cool. So Rollbar, it tracks my deploys that they're out there, and so if we do have errors that happen, you know, it's able to connect that, you know, this error was the first time it occurred was from this deploy, so maybe you should check, like, is maybe some code changed in this deploy that started causing that error, so you can kind of get correlation for problems, which is pretty cool. So we finished our deployment, and we should be able to go over to our test site and refresh. Of course, we don't see anything there because I'm not logged in. Oh goodness, what is the password for this staging site? Let's see if it's this. Yeah, cool. So we know it worked because this tools link was not there on the previous thing. The problem that we have right now is our staging site. I told you that I'm not, because it's Vagrant, it's not like some persistent box, so I'm not doing any kind of replication of my production database over to this virtual machine. If you had different machines up online, you could have more complex, involved staging setups where you actually maybe are doing a nightly replication to your staging environment, so you can kind of test things out as they look in reality. But I don't. So if I want to test out this feature and get some additional confidence that it works in my testing environment, what can I do? I think the way I wanted to approach this was actually try and trigger the job that I was actually running the data. So backing up the stream even farther, the way this whole process started was we did an integration and we're scraping data from the common app website, which is related to the domain of universities and colleges. There are some schools that use an application type called the common app. Details beyond that aren't super important, except to know that I want College Conductor to be able to know what schools use the common app. So I needed to get the list of schools that the common app website lists, and then I need to be able to connect the dots to my set of schools. That's kind of the mission. So we did the scraper that actually collected the data, and that was a Celery task, which is a Celery as the background worker that's commonly used with Django. And then we made the tool that can then work on the stuff that was scraped. And if I want to try and replicate, this is a virtual machine, so I'm not worried about security updates being out of date. If I want to replicate what production is going to be like, I guess I need to do the thing that collect the data that production is going to collect. And one way that we can do that is by coming in here and triggering the task that does the scan. I made a convenience file that lets me bring in all of the necessary like passwords to connect to databases and stuff in this environment, which is in that .env file, which I don't remember all that was in there that's sensitive, so I'm not going to open it up, but it's exporting some variables or sourcing some variables that make it possible to run stuff. And then I can come into Conductor, and I'm going to also need to source the virtual environment to make sure that we're running all the Python packages that get installed through the deployment process. And you can see in here is the manage.py file. So we do Python 3 manage.py shell. Okay, so we're in our staging environment. I'm at the Python shell for Django, and what I want to do is trigger the task that's going to do the web scraping, and hopefully it works in a reasonable amount of time. So let's find the task name. I put it under, I think it was trackers. Yeah. So this is the task that the chunk of code that I want to run right now to basically populate my staging database with some data that we can look at. And yeah, there's a whole stream devoted to how this is working, but the short version is it's doing a web scrape and looping over some pages of stuff. But what I'm interested in doing right now is from the shell triggering this task, because my staging environment is also running the Celery worker in the background. So it should be just as possible for me to trigger the task and verify if the output, if it succeeded at all, and then we can actually go to the tool and check that it's working. So I want to import from Conductor trackers import tasks, and I want to say tasks.scan common app schools, and this is a task, so it uses a function from Celery called delay, which will essentially kick it off to the worker. Although I suppose we could call it inline here too, that would work. But let's pretend to be a little bit closer to the real thing. So we sent that off to Celery, and we're going to look at the log file from Celery and see how it went. So if it's doing its thing right now, it's actually going out there and doing a web scrape of the stuff and seeing how things are going. So let's tail var log Celery, oops, Celery log. So there's a bunch of pages, and it's working right now. This is cool. See it working in real time, basically. So it's looping through, and the page is a page that lists every school that is part of this common app system. And it's a paginated page. So what that task was doing is it's basically saying, like, while you can still find a next page to go to, keep doing the loop. And then when you finally can't find any more pages to do, break out and call it quits. So I wasn't hammering the server. I'm also putting a 5-second delay in there, so that's why this is taking a little bit longer. I don't know how many pages there are, so this might take a minute or two. But frankly, this is probably enough for us to. Oh, wait a minute. Is that a true statement? I don't want to lie to you. No, okay, it's not, because the way I wrote this is I wrote it kind of, transaction is not the right word, but I'll use it anyway. So it's going through and putting all of the schools into one gigantic list, and then once it has processed all of the scraping, then it processes all those schools and creates all the database records. So it's sort of a staged approach. So it's either going to succeed or it's going to fail. So we have to wait for this to process before we see anything in the database. It's just how I designed it. It would have been possible, I suppose, to wait and or excuse me, to what am I trying to say? To process a set of schools and then add them to the database like each time a page is processed. But I wanted to do some differencing and making sure that any new schools that were added get and do like what's the add, modified, and deleted of the stuff that's in the database versus not in the database. So all right, so that wasn't too fast, or it wasn't too slow, I should say. So it went through that many pages of stuff. You can see at the very end, I just sent an email report to myself of all the schools that got added, and the task is completed. So now, if we come back over to here, aha, great. Well, we know this page is working, so that's how many records we just added. And we can check the Common App School. Oh, right off the bat, we have an interesting scenario. No problem, Vic J. Come back anytime, and happy to take your questions. So the tool's working. Kids, I hear you. I got two myself. The tool seems to be working, but there's something I want to deal with in this, is that I'm really not tracking a lot of like international schools. Like this tool is targeted at students that are in the US and going to US universities, just because I'm not trying to serve a global audience, because that's harder to do. So I need to extend the tool, and I think that's probably going to be about where we're going to stop. Well, let's deploy to production to finish this off. But when it comes time to pick this up next week, or excuse me, 2 weeks from now, I have a obligation next week and I won't be able to stream. But in the stream 2 weeks from now, what we're going to do, I guess, is to find a way to take a school that I don't want to handle right now and set it aside so that I keep processing with this tool. That capability is not here right now. It basically is, here's the list of schools, and you either do it now or you don't, and that's not the way I want to go. So let's come out of here. We're all done with Vagrant. We're done with staging. I'm fairly confident that it works. So now it's time to do a real deploy. And the real deploy is defined in a makefile. But again, it's a one command kind of thing. And at this point, if you've been following along, you should see that some of this should start to make sense of actually what this is doing. So I made a simple make target so they don't have to remember the invocation every time. But the core of what it's doing is saying, take the inventory defined in production, and we can look at the Playbook production inventory. There's nothing secretive about it, or nothing too secretive, I should say. And it's just the IP of my server, which you can probably look up. So it's just saying, here is the IP address that I want to connect to, and I only have one server, so it's functioning as all the roles. But you can imagine if I ever got additional traffic in the future, that I could start splitting this out. Like, let's say an obvious place to split would be, I want to have a separate server just for my database to have a defense in depth. If you know, like security stuff, like increase my security posture. And so a logical place to start would be to like split out a different server for my database, or maybe it's just it's getting my web traffic and my database traffic. They're fighting for I/O or memory or CPU. There's a whole host of things that reasons to why you might want to split it out. Today it's all in one, which is fine. So it's saying use that inventory file, that's what the -i is, as the basis of what you're going to run, and then run that same exact site YAML file that Vagrant ran and go through the same process. So this is like really barely different from what I just ran. There is some configuration file stuff differences that when we run it with this inventory, it's going to, let's see, group vars. You can see it's going to pull from a different variables file for certain parameters. So like things that are truly different, like when I need to use a different Django settings, or I need to use a different domain name, etc. Those are going to come from a different place because that's how Ansible runs. It just pulls variables differently depending on your inventory that you select. But for the most part, it will be the same stuff. So coming over here, we should be able to run make deploy, and you can see my make target is spitting out the Ansible playbook command that we saw in the make file. So there's nothing shocking there. And it's going to go through the same exact process that we saw earlier. The only difference this time is that we're going to that specific IP rather than Web 01, and it's going to go slower because it has to go over the internet rather than go over my local host. So let's see where that leaves us with our discussion. So we tested things out on Vagrant, and we saw like ways to, run commands to populate, to seed a staging environment with data that's reflective of production just by running some of the same kind of tools. We're deploying to production right now, and that's, I think we're already looking at nearly an hour and a half, so that's where I'm going to wrap things up for the evening. I think next week what we'll do is start refining the tool based on real data that we saw over here. There are refinements that I want to make to actually make this tool handle some of the cases that were not the happy path. And international universities being the primary first case to handle. So yeah, I think what's left to happen is to basically stare at Ansible, which is kind of therapeutic. Does anybody have any questions that they want me to try and address while we're waiting for this? I'm all ears. Or all eyes. What's the right expression? I don't know. Also, I guess we have future topics. Let's talk about future topics if no one has any questions. So next stream, we'll focus on taking the tool and modifying it to handle edge cases, I'll call them. That's this adjust to needs thing that I left super nebulous down here. So we started using the tool and got blocked right away because the very first school was something I didn't anticipate. So we need to adjust to needs. After we get through this tool, I've been working on some level of this for quite some time, and I think it's about time to move on to some other features and give you exposure to other parts of the web development process. So I was thinking of different things that we could do. The likely candidate that I've been considering is working on a development blog. So the College Conductor site is not really used by anyone except my wife, and even she doesn't use it very heavily. So it's still a tool that's being built out. It's still, in a way, not even at its minimum viable product stage. So we need to get it there. And one way to help get it there is to help get it in front of eyes of more people. And to do that, we need some search engine optimization, SEO. So I want to be able to have a development blog where I can link to right from the homepage, which is effectively this page, and maybe at the bottom in the footer have like blog, something just enough so that a Google spider web scraper will come through, click on blog, and find a development blog. And in that development blog, I want to be able to start putting information about these new features that I'm adding, like the fact that I've been automating the tracking of the common application. For if you're that doesn't probably doesn't mean anything to you. It barely means anything to me. But if you're someone who's in college admissions, it's useful to know that this tool tracks all of the schools that are part of the Common App and keeps up to date with that. That's really useful information. So I want to be able to kind of bubble up some of that information through some SEO. And I think a development blog kind of giving the progress of feature development might be a decent way to increase the reach of what College Conductor can do, because most of this stuff is behind a login. Like what's really available to a spider is not as much as you would think. So that's probably something that I'm considering building, kind of as an exercise to something fun to do, because there's nothing like pressing me to slam out certain features in a certain timeline. So it's kind of like build what I want, unless my wife, who is my real client, says we actually need this feature like really badly, or else it's never going to be useful, in which case we'll work on that. But I want to build this blog using some kind of markdown plugin that will integrate with Django, and I put in some options that I still need to investigate, and essentially the minimum version of the blog would be a listing page that would show the blog entries, and then on the fly when the page is visited versus pre-render it. That'll be part of that discussion. So that's kind of something that would be fun to do. And then there's all sorts of stuff that we could explore from that. We could talk about making RSS or add-on feeds, or we could talk about adding Open Graph Protocol stuff to make stuff more discoverable on different things. So that's a project that I've had in mind that could take us quite a while to build out if we built out a very full version. We're almost done with deployment, but that's something that I was thinking would be a next big project, and something that people could kind of follow the development along with. Yeah, where are we at? So, all right, cool. Notifying rollbar of deployment is the last step. Now we should be able to go to College Conductor. And there it is. This is the live site production. I'm already logged in as the super user, so I have access to the admin, and I've got the tools area. And it's got 824 Common App schools to process. So that's a success, which means I can now in my free time go and start doing that. Or maybe I'll wait until that next session where we improve the tool a little bit. Stream for the evening. I will be taking this stream and exporting it to YouTube and putting it on the playlist. So if you missed anything from earlier, if you came in late, it will be over there. I will share this on Twitter. You can catch me on Twitter as MB Layman. Feel free to follow me there. And then if you want to follow me on Twitch and subscribe and find out when new streams are happening, I would love if you do that. This is also an evolving stream. I've only been running this for, well, this is the 13th episode, and we don't run quite every week. So what is that, like 3 months?